Welcome to the Immigrantinlaw channel. Moving to Europe almost always involves a host of practical issues. One of the most important is where to live, and finding a place to rent often becomes the first major challenge after arriving. It can be especially difficult if you don't yet have a local credit history. You may have a stable income, the necessary documents, and serious plans for your life in a new country, but when you apply to rent, you may face skepticism from the landlord. At this point, many people start to think that it's impossible to rent an apartment without a credit history, but that's not true. Yes, in Europe, a credit history can play an important role, but it is far from the only factor that influences a landlord's decision. In this video, we'll break down why the lack of a local credit history raises questions, what documents can help compensate for this, and exactly what you can do to significantly increase your chances of approval. For an apartment owner, renting is always a matter of security and financial predictability. It is important for them to know that the tenant will be able to pay rent on time, will comply with the terms of the lease, and will not cause problems in the future. This is especially true for long-term leases, where the owner counts on stability and peace of mind. For them, a domestic credit history is one of the most familiar and straightforward ways to verify a tenant's reliability. Essentially, it is an indicator of your financial discipline within the local system, how you fulfill your obligations, how diligently you handle payments, and whether you have a proven track record of interacting with banks, services, or other financial institutions. If such a history exists, it is easier for the landlord to make a decision because they perceive fewer risks. If you don't have a credit history, the landlord has an additional question: how reliable are you as a tenant? And this isn't necessarily about mistrust toward you personally. More often than not, the landlord simply doesn't see the familiar benchmarks they rely on when selecting a tenant. For them, this isn't so much a negative as it is the absence of a clear signal. But here it's important to understand the key point. The absence of a credit history doesn't mean you're an unreliable candidate. It means only one thing: you've recently arrived and haven't yet had time to establish a financial profile in your new country. And that's precisely why your task is to demonstrate your reliability in other ways, through proof of income, documents, references, and the overall impression your application makes. When you don't have a local credit history, the landlord starts looking not at a single formal metric, but at your situation as a whole. At this point, what matters to them is not just the number on a report, which simply doesn't exist yet, but the overall impression they get of you as a potential tenant. They assess how clear, predictable, and financially stable you are, whether you can be trusted, and how smoothly a lease agreement with you would go. In practice, this means that documents confirming your income, your willingness to commit to a long-term lease, a polished self-presentation, prompt and courteous communication, as well as the availability of additional guarantees if needed, become particularly important. It is important for the landlord to see that you are not hiding any information, that you understand market rules, and that you take your obligations seriously. In other words, instead of relying on a single familiar factor, your credit score, you build a strong and convincing application from multiple elements. And if everything looks consistent and reliable, the lack of a credit history no longer seems like a critical obstacle. It is precisely this comprehensive approach that most often yields results. The first thing you really should focus on is proof of income. If you have an employment contract, a letter from your employer, a job offer, recent pay stubs, or bank statements, this is already a significant advantage when applying to rent. For the landlord, such documents serve as a clear and concrete substitute for a lack of credit history. It is important for the landlord to see that you have a real, stable, and verified source of income. For them, this is one of the main indicators that rent will be paid on time and without unnecessary risks. Even if you've only recently started working, the mere fact of having official employment already makes your application significantly stronger, especially if you can show your contract and payment terms. If you don't have a local employment history yet, that's not a deal breaker. In such a situation, you can use other documents: proof of income from another country, savings in a bank account, a remote work contract, a letter from your employer stating your position and income level, and sometimes tax documents, if you have them. All of this helps create a clearer and more reliable picture of your financial situation for the landlord. The main thing is to show that you are capable of paying the rent without difficulty, that you plan your budget, and that you are not in a situation of financial uncertainty. The clearer and more convincing this is evident from your documents, the easier it will be for the landlord to make a decision in your favor. If you don't have a credit history yet, you can strengthen your application with additional guarantees. One of the most common options is the willingness to pay a security deposit and, if necessary, several months' rent in advance. For the landlord, this reduces risks and makes your offer more attractive. But it's important to present this correctly, not as a desperate attempt to get the apartment at any cost, but as a calm and logical measure. For example, you can explain that you've recently moved, so your local credit history hasn't been established yet, but you're willing to confirm your solvency through prepayment or an increased security deposit within acceptable terms. This approach shows that you understand market logic and are ready to resolve the issue in a civilized and transparent manner. In some European countries, a guarantor is a good solution. This is a person who has official status, income, and a financial history in that country, and, if necessary, can serve as an additional guarantee under the lease agreement. For the landlord, this option is very appealing because it provides additional protection. If you have this option, it's worth using. But if you don't have a guarantor, that's no reason to give up your search. In this case, you simply need to pay extra attention to all other parts of your application: the documents, financial proof, and the quality of your communication with the landlord. One of the most underrated aspects is exactly how you write to the landlord or agent. In many cases, several people apply for the same apartment at once, and if all the messages look the same, the advantage goes to the candidate who comes across as more clear, calm, and organized. That's why it's very important to prepare a short and polite message about yourself. It should state who you are, what you do, how long you're looking to rent, how many people will be living in the apartment, whether you have a job, and if you're ready to provide documents. No unnecessary pressure, no excessive emotion, no overly long explanations. Your goal is to make an impression as someone with whom it will be comfortable and safe to sign a lease. Sometimes it is precisely this first message that becomes the very factor that opens the door to a viewing. It is a very wise decision to gather all your rental documents before you even begin your active search. Not when you've already been asked for documents, but in advance. This package usually includes a passport, visa, or residence permit, if applicable, an employment contract or job offer, bank statements, proof of income, sometimes references from previous landlords, and a brief introduction about yourself as a prospective tenant. When all of this is ready, you can respond faster than other candidates and immediately appear more organized. For the landlord, this is an important signal. You take the process seriously, which means you'll likely treat your future obligations the same way. If you have rented a place before, it's helpful to request a recommendation from your previous landlord. Even if it's from another country, it can still work in your favor. A good recommendation shows that you paid rent on time, took good care of the apartment, and adhered to the lease terms. This doesn't completely replace a credit history, but it's a great addition to your application. Recommendations that include specific details make a particularly strong impression. The length of the lease, no outstanding debts, good behavior, and careful treatment of the property. Very often, after moving, people immediately apply only for the most sought-after apartments in the city center, at a good price, in modern buildings, and in high-demand neighborhoods. The problem is that competition for such properties is almost always fierce, and if there are local tenants among the applicants with a complete financial history and a profile familiar to the landlord, the choice often goes against the newcomer. Therefore, it's wiser to broaden your search criteria from the start. Look not only at the city center but also at neighboring areas. Consider not only ideal options but also simpler ones. Pay attention not only to private listings but also to agencies, short-term rentals, and serviced apartments. Sometimes it's much more advantageous to first rent a place for a few months, settle in comfortably, get the necessary paperwork in order, and only then look for a more comfortable long-term option. Many people view temporary rentals as a failure, but in reality, it's a perfectly reasonable stage of adjustment. Temporary housing gives you time to get your bearings in the city, figure out which neighborhoods are truly convenient, understand how public transportation works, learn what requirements landlords most often have, and determine exactly what kind of apartment you need. Additionally, during this time, you can open a bank account, start earning income within the country, gather additional documents, and thereby make your next rental application much stronger. Sometimes this approach turns out to be the most practical and saves not only money, but also a great deal of stress. It's important to remember that the European rental market doesn't operate the same way everywhere. Even if the general logic is similar everywhere, the specific requirements of landlords, agencies, and management companies can vary significantly depending on the country, city, and even the type of housing. In some countries, landlords primarily look at the level of official income. In others, they look for a guarantor. In others still, they look at credit history, rental insurance, or other financial safeguards. That is precisely why there is no single universal document that will automatically resolve the issue in any situation. What worked perfectly in one country may play almost no role in another. For this reason, it is so important to understand local requirements in advance and not rely on a single scenario for the entire European market. But despite all the differences, three basic principles apply almost everywhere: transparency, financial stability, and predictability. It's important for the landlord to see that you're not hiding anything, can prove your ability to pay, and generally come across as someone with whom the rental will go smoothly and without unpleasant surprises. If the landlord understands who you are, what you do, how you'll pay the rent, and why it's safe to sign a contract with you, the likelihood of approval becomes significantly higher. That's precisely why, when it comes to renting, it's not just the documents themselves that matter, but also how competently and consistently you put together your entire application. To put it as practically as possible, the strategy looks like this. First, you gather a strong set of documents so you don't have to scramble to find everything at the last minute and waste time. Then, you prepare a brief, well-written, and confident self-presentation that immediately gives the landlord an understanding of who you are, what you do, and why you can be trusted. After that, choose realistic options based on your budget and terms, and don't limit your search to only the most popular properties, where competition is usually particularly high. And, if necessary, further strengthen your application with guarantees, a security deposit, an advance payment, or a guarantor. This approach comes across as much stronger and more professional than chaotic, unprepared responses, where documents are gathered at the last minute and the message to the landlord ends up being too generic or unconvincing. When it comes to renting, a great deal depends not only on the fact that you've reached out, but also on how confidently and consistently you navigate the entire process. Because in the rental market, it's often not the first person to apply who wins, but the one who immediately comes across as the most reliable, understandable, and financially stable candidate. And the better prepared you are in advance, the higher the likelihood that the landlord will consider your application first and take it seriously. The most important thing to remember: not having a local credit history isn't a death sentence or a reason to give up on finding a place to live. It's simply one of the typical challenges people face after moving. Yes, in this situation, you need to prepare a little better. Yes, sometimes you have to provide more documents and be more flexible. But this is absolutely a solvable issue. When you understand how a landlord thinks, what matters to them, and how to structure your application correctly, your chances of successfully renting a place become significantly higher. And if you're just planning to immigrate to the EU and need legal support with immigration matters, submit a request for a free consultation with the lawyers at Immigrantinlaw. We'll develop the best relocation strategy for you, prepare all the necessary documents, explain the legal nuances in detail, and answer all your questions. We'll analyze your case, your goals, and your situation without using any templates. Want to learn more or start the process today? Contact us. All contact details are listed in the description below this video. We're here to help you take a confident step toward a new life. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ask your questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. Discover a world of possibilities with Immigrantinlaw.